In all the years the United States has had an all-volunteer force, which dates back to July 1st, 1973, when the Nixon administration and Congress allowed the authority for the draft to lapse, never has there been a time when our Guard and Reserve forces played as large a role in our military operations as they do today. But in those days, the designated role for the reserve components was very different.
It was truly a strategic reserve. We had the Guard and Reserve there in case we had a major conflict. We would call them up. We'd have plenty of time to train them. And the imperative to be ready and have the same equipment was not there. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. It's just the imperative we had.
What we advertised was 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer. That's all we asked. And that's what was expected. We were not going to mobilize and go to war unless, you know, the Russians came across the Fulda Gap, and we were going to be the strategic reserve. So we were going to have plenty of time before we were needed to mobilize, to train, to get organized before we were ever going to get employed.
But some reservists recall a sense of disappointment during their early years of service.
We had organizations that had no idea what they was doing. They was looking for 14 days annual training, which was in most cases a big party, and 2 days a month.
Command Sergeant Major Caffey served in Vietnam, and his expectations for the reserve were different from the reality he found when he reported for duty.
To me, it was insulting. I come from active component to a reserve component that was basically a social group.
At the time, the reserves were just that, a force held in reserve, there just in case the worst-case scenarios of the day happened. As a result, the priorities for both training and equipping the force were much different from today.
Now, back then, you got the leftovers from the regular Army. We had the old uniforms, the old boots. Everything was handed down that was de-exed from the regular Army to include the equipment. It was really outdated.
Meanwhile, for men and women serving in the National Guard, the story was much the same.
The National Guard was under-equipped. Remember, before September 11th, it was a strategic reserve. The nation made a strategic decision to accept risk and not equip the Guard fully. We were going to fight a different kind of force on a different kind of timetable. It was a conventional fight. We had plenty of time under that old model, the old Cold War model, to call up the Guard, equip the Guard, fill out their formations, give them some training, and then ultimately send them in the latter stages of the operation to reinforce the active duty force.
Things started to change during the Reagan era with more equipment, better training opportunities. And then, of course, Desert Shield, Desert Storm came about, and there was a mass call-up of the reserves for the first time since Korea.
And as our forces continue to arrive, they can look forward to the support of the finest reserve components in the world. We are activating those special categories of reservists that are essential to completing our mission. The United States considers its reserve forces to be an integral part of the total military command.
But it was a call-up many reservists hadn't expected.
It was a huge surprise to the Army Reserve soldiers because we had been told we would never go anywhere, and then when actuality hit and we deployed, many of them were in just total shock.
Nearly 228,000 men and women from our reserve components were mobilized during Operations Desert Shield and Storm, and some 106,000 served in the Kuwait Theater of Operations.
Desert Shield, Desert Storm was a catalytic event in one way because it gave us an opportunity to check to see where we were successful over the past 15 years of non-usage and where we had some shortcomings. In some cases, some units were very ready. Aviation units, by and large, because they do their mission on a daily basis. If you're flying an aircraft, you have to be able to fly it every day, whether you're a reserve or active component. Infantry battalions, however, has suffered a greater challenge because, unlike aviation units, they didn't do their mission every day. They were more the traditional weekend drilling reservist, and they were multi-sited, so a battalion commander might have to travel to 4 or 5 different sites just to see all of his company commanders.
I think Desert Storm was a test of our ability to mobilize the force and deploy it. But what it did not test is our capability to sustain it.
In the years following the Gulf War, the use of Guard and Reserve forces continued, particularly in support of operations monitoring the no-fly zones over Iraq. In those operations, the United States air components had the lead role. Air Guard and Reserve people and hardware played a part.
We were using the Air Expeditionary Force to field our air forces for Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch through the mid to late 90s, and we were cycling our people in these AEFs.
As the turn of the century approached, the no-fly zone operations continued, with no end in sight. The media came up with new labels they linked to the operations, such as the Forgotten War and the Long War. Then, on September 11, 2001, the unthinkable event that changed our world forever. In the days and weeks following the 9/11 attacks, thousands of Guard and Reserve forces were mobilized. They helped safeguard our ports, patrolled our skies, beefed up security at military bases and airports throughout the country. Meanwhile, U.S. leaders began to plan, because one thing the attacks made obvious was that the fight in our future would be nothing like those of the past.
That morning was a signal, a sign, a dramatic shot heard around the world, so to speak, that changed the National Guard from a strategic reserve to an operational force on no notice.
On October 7, 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, the military's part in the global war on terrorism.
Where's that fire coming from?
In Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, the Philippines, Operation Enduring Freedom forces targeted terrorists and their supporters.
Baghdad is under attack. Basra is under attack.
Then, in 2003, U.S. forces took on an additional mission, as a U.S.-led multinational force again invaded Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom had 3 objectives: search for weapons of mass destruction, end the reign of Saddam Hussein and his support for terrorism, and free the Iraqi people. Guard and Reserve forces had key roles from the start.
When the initial force went to OIF, when that combat operations kicked off in March of 2003, a significant portion of the Marine Corps in 1MEF, who was the fighting force for the Marine Corps in OIF, a significant portion of that was reserves.
About 1.1 million men and women serve in the Guard and Reserve. They're 46% of the total force. Army Guard and Reserve have the largest portion of those numbers, with some 550,000 people. And right now, those forces, along with their active duty Army counterparts, bear the biggest burden in today's operations.
In the combat portion, obviously all services are participating, but in the aftermath of it, the majority of troops are Army in theater, working with the Marines having the rest of the ground force.
Where we are today, for the last 5+ years, the much increased utilization of all reserve forces, whether it be units, detachments, or individuals, is now in kind of a steady state of some level of mobilization.
The global war on terrorism, OIF, OEF, is really testing our ability to sustain a long-term deployment of forces on a regular basis.
And as the number of lives lost grows, while hundreds more are gravely injured, much talk is focused on whether or not U.S. forces can keep up the pace.
We, in fact, have been doing that now for 6 years, and there are those that really thought the Guard would break and that we've been unable to stand this kind of stress on the force. And you would think that we would not be able to recruit and retain our force under this kind of stress. In fact, the truth is we actually are flourishing.
Now, that wouldn't necessarily be the logical pattern you'd think we'd follow. As much as we're using people, as much deployment as people are doing, we've sent people into the combat operations 3 and 4 times now in the last 5 years, some of them. And they stay with us. I think they stay with us because they like being part of our units and they are doing something important.
We have people on their 4th, 5th deployment already, and we have over 4,000 people right now with their hands up in the air, willing to train for any mission to go serve.
Nearly all the reserve components say 2006 was a good year for both recruitment and retention. Along with better training and equipment, improvements in readiness throughout the reserve components has been a top priority. That means more emphasis is placed on things like making sure families are prepared and that troops are physically fit.
We're mobilizing people to some pretty austere, harsh conditions, whether it's 126 degrees in full body armor in the desert, whether it's the cold of the mountains. You need to be fit when you get there. And we realize this now, and so we hold them to a higher standard.
But on top of supporting military operations around the world, there are still the obligations that must be met on the home front when disasters like 9/11 and 2005's hurricanes happen.
At one point in that Katrina response, the Air National Guard had 50% of all the C-130s in the inventory in the air in response to citizens of our nation. It was extraordinary.
Okay, here, we've got a rescue in progress.
Coast Guard men and women also played a big part in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, ultimately helping save more than 30,000 lives.
The interesting thing about the Coast Guard Reserve and the Coast Guard, if an event occurs, the Coast Guard folks go to their stations to get in touch with their chain of command, and they're ready. And the paperwork might not be done right that minute, but darn it, they're ready to go, and they were ready. It happened in 9/11, happened with Rita, it happened with Katrina.
The training Coast Guard reservists get isn't on simulators or in military exercises. They fulfill their training requirements doing what the Coast Guard does every day.
When our reserves train and get ready for the next event, they train and work together day in and day out with our active duty components doing homeland security, search and rescue. So when they're drilling on a weekend, they are conducting those missions.
In addition to its state role of responding in case of emergency, the National Guard took on a unique new mission last summer. In August, the Guard began the 2-year Operation Jumpstart, an effort to help safeguard the U.S. southwest border by providing support and improving the capabilities of the Border Patrol.
They have virtually returned hundreds of badges back to the border because the National Guard has enabled them to be freed up to do law enforcement work where heretofore the Border Patrol agents were being used for other than law enforcement. We've expanded their eyes and ears dramatically. We can see parts of the border and report on operations occurring on the border that the Border Patrol, previous to the Guard involvement, was unable to do. We've done a dramatic job of increasing their what they call tactical infrastructure, their vehicle barriers, their road nets, their ability to have mobility of the Border Patrol agents laterally along the border, in placing sensors, putting in fences, lots and lots of capabilities that the Guard has brought to this mission that is much appreciated by U.S. Border Patrol.
Around the world, joint operations between all the military services and utilizing both active and reserve forces is happening more every day. And to meet mission needs, many services are often forming units made up of a mix of active, Guard, and reserve men and women from all over the country.
The reason we can do that like that is because we all have the same standards for training and for operational readiness. So we can put together sort of a rainbow of units to do the same kind of missions with the same airplanes and not miss a beat, because we all do the same kind of training, have the same tactics, training, and procedures.
But even though training and equipment are improved over the Cold War years and men and women are continuing their service, reserve component leaders are always looking ahead, thinking of new initiatives and incentives to help keep the force strong in the future.
We walk a tightrope. The tightrope is how do we retain a force that's greatly needed, that's both a citizen and a warrior. If we be too heavy-handed on the warrior side, we're going to lose it. If we're lackadaisical on the citizen side, we're going to lose them as well. So we got to do this balancing act.
Equally critical to maintaining force strength is knowing where to send them, a difficult task.
Because the enemy has a vote. I mean, we have not exactly had a perfect crystal ball in any regard in forecasting how many forces we would need in each one of these rotations for Iraq and Afghanistan. Things have not gone exactly according to our plan. The enemy has its own plan.
Since 9/11, more than 500,000 men and women from our reserve components have deployed. Today, some 90,000 are involved in U.S. military operations around the world. The change from the standby mentality of the Cold War years to the always-ready requirements of the post-9/11 world hasn't been easy for our Guard and Reserve forces. But adjusting internally to the change isn't the only issue. There are new organizations, such as the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Northern Command, that weren't a consideration when legislation outlining the roles of the reserve components was written. Those and other issues led to the formation of an independent commission on the National Guard and Reserves. And according to commission reports released thus far, a lot of work has to be done to truly make the reserve components an operational force.
That's a huge paradigm shift from being a strategic reserve to being an operational reserve. And yet our commission has found that DOD has not made any of the underlying changes in the laws, rules, regulations, policies, procedures, funding, and equipping to make it truly a ready operational reserve.
One of the Commission's key findings in a report sent to Congress in March relates to National Guard equipment levels. According to the Commission report, 88% of our stateside Army Guard units are not mission ready because of equipment shortages.
So DOD has declared that we have this operational reserve, but they haven't made the changes necessary to ensure that such a operational reserve is sustainable. We have concluded that on current situation, it is not sustainable.
The Commission's final report, to include recommended reforms in legislation, is due to Congress in January 2008. As for the reasons why equipment is so scarce among stateside Guard units, leaders say the force had a limited stockpile of equipment prior to 9/11, and deployments over the years since then have taken a toll.
So as we have sent forces to Afghanistan and Iraq and other places around the world, we've cross-leveled this already low level of equipment fill to ensure that everybody has what they should have when they go overseas, and that has depleted our equipment stocks significantly. When you add the fact that we leave some of the equipment in theater, which we rightfully should do to save time and money for the troops that are following on to them, this exacerbates the problem, or even makes our equipment problem back here at home even worse.
Although the fix will take some time, the Defense Department has earmarked a considerable amount of money over the next few years to address the shortage.
We have about $9 billion budgeted for equipment strictly for the National Guard.
Other significant improvements the department's new secretary has committed to are reducing deployments to 12 months and a move to deploy the Guard as units instead of as individuals, something the Guard's chief says his people have wanted for some time.
is far different if that person, that citizen soldier, were to come home and talk to his spouse or her spouse or their employer and say, my unit has been called again and I have to go. It is a much, much different dynamic.
However, Secretary Gates cautions the change won't be easy.
There will be a painful transition period because we've been using individual volunteers over the last several years. And so some units are going to have to deploy early, some are going to be extended. But my hope is that in a year or so we will be to the point where we can begin with the increase in the end strength in the Army and the Marine Corps and these changes in mobilization policy, that we can begin to get back to the kinds of dwell times here at home that we want.
The end strength increases the Secretary believes will help lighten the deployment load add up to about 92,000 more people between the Army and Marine Corps over the next 5 years.
Let's go, let's go, let's go!
Meanwhile, the ultimate goal all Guard and Reserve leaders are reaching for is a force of men and women trained, equipped, and ready to go when called.
Nowadays, you're not going to have the time to do a lot of training after you get alerted. You're going to have to be ready.
In turn, the groundwork is in place to give everyone who serves the predictability they so desperately want. Once fully implemented, our military men and women will become eligible for deployment once every 5 years.
And we're not there yet. We're spinning faster than 5 years because we don't have the force balanced right now. We're still learning. This is a different war.
What we had were a whole lot of Guardsmen and Reservists in specialties that were the kind of specialties we needed in the 90s or prior to that, but they weren't the kind of specialties we need today. And what we really need today, and probably over the next few years, next 10 to 20, are military police, civil affairs, engineering units, air units.
Mr. Hall says the conversion of 125,000 Guard and Reserve positions identified as obsolete is underway.
We have about 80,000 of that done today, so we need to rebalance and get the force to reflect what we need. And at the end of the day, the question will be, when we rebalance and when we civilianize a lot of functions, is the military large enough?
Determining how new technologies will be incorporated into the Guard and Reserve forces of the future is another consideration for military leaders. For example, the new NV-22 Osprey the Marine Corps is getting ready to deploy.
And at some point, 5, 6, 7 years from now, those V-22 pilots or maintainers some of them will decide that they're going to transition from active duty. Now, if we don't have a capability of the MV-22 and the reserve component, what are they going to do?
Another challenge the reserve components face is the impact of the 2006 base closure and realignment mandates. Across the force, many units and some bases are being deactivated and closed. And for the Navy and Air Force reserves, which have also been directed to reduce their numbers by about 7,000 each, the pain will be that much greater over the next few years.
We're going to affect about 15,000 people's lives through base closure and the personnel cuts, so it's significant.
People are the DoD's most costly resource, but even as the personnel reductions save money, they're also made feasible by improving technology. For example, Navy cruisers in World War II had 1,100 crew. The cruisers of today have a crew of 450.
Just because we're coming down doesn't mean it's worse. It just means we're getting smarter about the way we do business.
And because today's conflicts are very different from those of the past, the Navy is also changing where it takes care of business.
I mean, it's coming from the deep blue water to the green water, and then we call it brown water where you go up the rivers. So we're building some of the old brown water riverine force under Navy Expeditionary Combat Command.
But even as monies are doled out for new equipment and adjustments are made to how the reserve components operate, recruiting the right people to take care of the mission is always an underlying concern. And some are worried over what the future holds in store.
We've done some research here in Navy through the Chief of Naval Personnel. 72% of our nation's youth are now ineligible for military service for a wide variety of reasons. Start with just not in physical shape, don't have the skill sets, tattoos, drug use, criminal, and parents who don't want their kids to serve in an economy that's doing pretty good on the outside.
Keeping up recruitment and retention, balancing skills to meet today's needs, and reducing wear and tear on people and equipment are just a few items on the daunting list of goals set for the Guard and Reserve in the next few years. But according to the generals and admirals leading our reserve components, the world situation today demands no less than a force fully ready to respond when and where it's needed.
We will look back 5 years from now, and these will be the good old days. If we think we're busy now, I think we're going to be more essential and even more busy in the years to come.